Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Paul O'Hara, lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University, and I'm very pleased to chair this hustings on behalf of the event organisers, Lancashire Wildlife Trust and Save Greater Manchester Greenbelt. We've got a series of candidates for the Greater Manchester mayoral election. Very grateful for them for giving up their time this evening to join us. I should just say Hannah Spencer from the Green Party was invited but was unable to attend and sends her apologies. Each candidate has been invited to make a short opening address by way of introduction and hopefully to provide some headline views on the environment. So without further ado, I'll open that to Andy Barnum from Labour.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening, everybody. I set out as Mayor 7 years ago with a mission to make Greater Manchester the UK's leading green city region. And 7 years on, I think that's exactly what we are. We've had green summits every year since 2018, and we've built a compelling policy vision based around a science-based target for net zero of 2038. Now, in this election, I'm not one of those who are saying go slow on net zero or have a referendum on it or scrap it altogether. I believe that our future prosperity lies in fully facing up to a net zero city region and capturing all of the benefits and the prosperity that comes from that. We've developed a plan for public transport, for energy, for buildings. Obviously, we're furthest on with the B network, and that's being implemented, cleaning up our air and giving people much better, more affordable public transport. We have a plan to decarbonise our energy grid, and that's a unique thing that we've done with local area energy plans across our city region. And from next April, we will take much greater control of retrofit funding, so improving people's homes as well as decarbonising them. That's the vision that I'm standing on. I'm proud of what we've achieved, but in many ways, the best is yet to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Dan Barker from Reform.
Good afternoon. So Greater Manchester is blessed with some unique and beautiful areas of Greenbelt. And although there's enough brownfield land supply to meet new housing needs for the next 17 years, Places for Everyone regional master plan that was designed, developed and approved by our Labour Mayor and our Labour-led councils will see the destruction of precious Greenbelt to build warehouses and market housing. Market housing that will deliver mostly 3-4 bed executive homes with no targets for social or affordable housing mandated at the regional planning level. All this from a so-called socialist administration. In its current format, Places for Everyone is an act of vandalism and needs to be stopped. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Jake Austin, Liberal Democrats.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to talk on this important subject. My name's Jake, and I'm running as your Lib Dem candidate in this election. I was born and raised in Wigan. I've now settled down in Stockport with my own husband, Andy, where I'm now a councillor. Stockport is the only borough in Greater Manchester not controlled by Labour, and it's controlled by the Liberal Democrats. And there we've made climate action a huge priority for Stockport. It's in everything we do, because anything less than urgent action is not good enough when it comes to the climate, from installing new segregated cycling infrastructure to electric vehicle charging stations to building affordable housing while also protecting green spaces. I want to bring this action to all of Greater Manchester, but it's not just in Stockport. Across all of Greater Manchester, we've got councillors and campaigners fighting for a greener region. In Trafford, we have councillors protecting our green belt. In Salford, we have the fantastic Clean Up the Quays campaign, which is led by Liberal Democrats. And in central Manchester, we have brilliant councillors pushing developers to build more parks as the area grows. These are priorities and actions of Liberal Democrats all across our region, and I'm standing as your mayor candidate to bring this action to everywhere in Greater Manchester. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. And finally, Laura Evans, Conservatives.
Hello, thank you very much for having me here. So there are a couple of points that Andy raises that are quite good, actually, about where we're heading on improving the environment, making sure that we retrofit buildings, and I can get with all of that. And I think there's an awful lot more we could be doing to make sure that everybody feels inclined to do better and to look to make sure that we save and invest and develop new ways forward to make sure that we do have a better environment. But I think some of the measures that have taken place are just unacceptable. So building on the green belt, for example, it's an oxymoron, isn't it? Because when you think about it, we're rushing towards making sure that we get to a better place with our environment, but at the same time prepared to build all over the green belt in Greater Manchester. Instead of striving to develop new and better methods to work with our brownfield sites and our independent developers. The independent developers are very keen to pick up on those brownfield sites, to build affordable housing, to make sure that people feel that they have homes they can move into in the right places. But developing on the brownfield site also allows us to make sure that we use those sites better where there is already infrastructure. We don't have infrastructure in the Greenbelt plan that Andy has. So for me, it's absolutely essential that we review the whole plan, go back to the drawing board and start again.
Thank you, Laura. And just a quick note on the format of the hustings. So we have crowdsourced a series of questions. We've got 6 questions that have been submitted across various aspects of the environment. I'll pose those questions to the candidates. We'll go. We'll have a mix of people who will respond first to those questions, but everybody, all the candidates will have an opportunity to respond. Candidates have been asked for brevity, so around about 1 minute for responses, just so that we can get through further questions. Anybody watching online, you can submit questions, and we will try to pick up as many of those, group those together and pick up as many of those as we can toward the end of the session. So question 1 is a question about wildlife. Everyone says they think nature is important, but if biodiversity loss is to be reversed, we need real champions who will speak out and make it a priority. Will you be a champion for nature? And if so, what will that mean in practice? And that's from Chris Davies at the Lancashire Wildlife Trust. Dan, could you open with that one, please?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So yes, biodiversity is very important, and I think whilst we're talking about in this kind of thing, you know, the Greenbelt allocation that's in the Places for Everyone plan has got to be the priority. To remove that from Places for Everyone, to protect our Greenbelt, protect the habitats there and the wildlife. That is the single most important thing the Mayor can and should do in the next term to protect and improve the environment around Greater Manchester.
Thank you, Dan. Jake?
Just to touch on the point that Dan was making there, one of the reasons in Stockport that we actually moved away from the Places for Everyone approach back when it was a spatial framework is because we were not happy with the green belt allocation in terms of building on houses, and we also thought there was some priorities that we could put into our own local plan. I do feel there is an opportunity as Greater Manchester to come together for a plan for all of Greater Manchester, but I'm not sure Places for Everyone is it. One of the reasons as well in terms of building our own local plan across Stockport that we decided to go that route is that it gave us greater control over things like biodiversity. So in our draft local plan that we're putting together now, one of the key areas that we are working on is addressing that biodiversity by changing the nationally mandated 10% of biodiversity for all new developments to 20%, which is double what we are required to do by law. That is an easy win within a draft within a local plan that we can put together to make sure we get better infrastructure for wildlife on all new future developments, and it's something that I would like to see in any future Places for Everyone plan or similar infrastructure that we have moving forward.
Thank you, Jake. Laura?
Yeah, I mean, I think we go back to the point that if you build all over the greenbelt, you damage the environment and you make it more difficult for wildlife habitats. So I think there's the whole raft of things. I mean, tree planting is a massive thing that we should be doing across Greater Manchester, even in our built-up city areas. The Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, Places for Everyone as it's now called, I call it a soft sell that. But that was in 2014 when it was sort of put together. And in that time, there isn't one council in Greater Manchester that hasn't called a climate emergency, to my knowledge. So clearly, if we've got a climate emergency and we've got an outdated plan, we need to make that, we need to make that change. We need to say, look, just stop. Let's not do this anymore. Let's look again at what we can do better. And the brownfield sites are there. Now, the Save the Greater Manchester Greenbelt has made argument after argument about the alternative plans for brownfield sites. And I think that that's essential that we look at that again. And that will then obviously improve the wildlife, save the green belt, and all the things that go with that. So I urge you to reconsider about the entire plan. And I certainly, if elected, would do that.
Thank you, Laura. And finally, Andy.
The question, we're already doing precisely what you asked. Greater Manchester Combined Authority, with the support of our 10 councils, declared a biodiversity emergency in 2022. In March, we had our first State of Nature report. So there is evidence there that we are taking the state of wildlife across Greater Manchester much more seriously. We've supported peatland restoration on Barton Moss and elsewhere. The City of Trees initiative with the planting of trees right across the city region. I made a particular commitment at the last mayoral election to bring in a Green Spaces Fund. And I think it's been one of the quiet successes of this mayoral term, with almost 90 community projects with volunteers involved at a very significant level, bringing through improvements to green space across all areas of the city region. And just to say something about Places for Everyone, you know, firstly, there's no acknowledgement that by having a plan, you actually protect the green belt that stays. In Stockport, already we're seeing challenges and bids to build on green belt because they are outside of the plan. And that is a problem. You don't protect your green belt by simply having no plan. But secondly, there are strong environmental policies in Places for Everyone. And you wouldn't think that given the one-sided commentary we've heard so far. But for instance, there was a presumption against fracking. I wonder whether Laura and Dan support that. There is the requirement for a nature recovery strategy to sit alongside Places for Everyone. There is a brownfield preference policy at the heart of Places for Everyone. In the end of the day, some of these things are tough, but you have to have a plan. And if you just do the easy politics and say, we'll have no plan, then actually you put the green belt at greater risk than doing the difficult thing and having a clear plan for the city region. When I came in as mayor, there was a very different plan on the table, and as a result, we saw a reduction in green belt take of over 50% from the plan that I inherited to the one that exists now. So there has been a lot of listening. There has been a reduction, but at the end of the day, the government sets housing targets. Councils can't ignore those housing targets. The houses have to go somewhere. You have
Sorry,
to have
Andy, sorry to jump in, but yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I've just been made aware that there is a problem with the chat issue with chat, a problem in the chat function on YouTube, which we're trying to fix behind the scenes. So do please bear with us in terms of that. The next question regards clean air. This is from Bill Curtis at Youth Leads. Last year, Client Earth took the government to court over its climate plan, and as a result, the responsibility to boost clean air quality has been passed on to local bodies. If you don't want the clean air zone, something else needs to be put in place. What would that be, and why would it be good for Greater Manchester? And let's open with Jake Austin, please.
Yeah, of course. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about clean. I think the key to getting it right is to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to disincentivize people from using polluting vehicles. We're already doing work on that in Stockport in terms of electrical vehicle charging infrastructure and work on active travel. But I would like to see that continue across all of Greater Manchester. That includes further and continued investment in our public transport infrastructure to give people an option to be able to travel outside of their cars. For me, that also means not just connecting people to the city centre, it means connecting people across all of Greater Manchester, no matter where you live. I live in Hazel Grove. If I want to get to Altrincham by public transport, it takes me an hour and 20 minutes. If I choose to do it by car, it takes me 20 minutes. So it's obvious if I'm in a rush or if I need to get somewhere quickly, what option I'm going to take. We need to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place where those journeys are no longer taking an hour longer to do by public transport than they are by car. And the reason I say we should focus on the investment side of things and incentivizing people to make those choices is because I don't believe that we bring in a solution that is overall better for the environment and better for by punishing people who are unable to make those choices because we don't currently have the infrastructure in place to facilitate better travel across all of the region. We get there by giving people the option to make better travel choices overall.
Thank you, Jake. Laura.
Hi, yes, thanks for the question. So I never thought a 493 square mile charging zone was a good idea. It didn't deal with the issues tightly enough, and I thought it would be very detrimental to businesses. So I would never encourage that. But I do think we need to look at areas where we can improve. So if, for example, you have roads that are clearly giving up, higher readings, then surely that's an area that you would fix on a very localized level. At the time, it was Tameside and Wigan that were doing that. I believe there was a new report saying that it was city centre. So I actually don't really trust the reports. So I would have a full review across Greater Manchester. And I think also some of the problems that we have with the low traffic neighbourhoods and the cycling, we've actually caused more congestion. Now, I met people in Manchester last week about the bus gates they were pushing traffic onto other roads and causing more issues. I don't think the clean air zone, a 493 square mile charging zone was the answer. And I also don't think pushing traffic onto the same roads is the answer. I think we need to be more innovative than that. I think we've got canal pathways. I think we've got various other ways that we could, if we put our mind to it, look to have alternative cycling methods around Greater Manchester. But the push to push cars out of every area, vans and businesses. I went to Castleton recently in Rochdale. Those businesses are closing down because of the cycle lanes. This is not a solution. It's not a solution for businesses, and it certainly doesn't seem to be working. Thank you.
And Andy, please.
The question and the alternative is twofold. Firstly, it's the B network. When we renegotiated the legal direction with the government, we got a compliance date of 2026, so 2 years later. And the logic was to let the full effect of the B network be felt in terms of cleaning up our air, because that clearly is a better way to do it, to give people the option of good quality, affordable public transport. The thing about taking control of buses, which I'm the first mayor in the UK to do, outside of London, is that you can then dictate the pace of change and the pace of decarbonisation. So we've seen 50 zero emission buses go into the streets of Wigan and Bolton, 50 in the north of Greater Manchester. The requirements that we've set in the re-regulation of buses, that all buses are cleaner and greener, and we'll soon see the first all-electric bus depot in Greater Manchester in Stockport. So that is the answer, alongside, though, an investment-led approach to clean air to deal with the remaining areas that we will need to act on. So that is, in my view, a better route to clean air. The B network giving people here London-style public transport, which is what I promised I would do last time. It's been a big thing to put buses back under public control, a big battle, but I've seen it through. I won that battle, and we are now taking control of our bus system. But alongside that, we are waiting to hear from the government in respect of Greater Manchester's investment-led approach to cleaning up our air, and we're still waiting to hear from the government on that. But those two things together would achieve compliance, and I would argue that's a better way to go.
And finally, Dan.
Thank you, Paul. So if I step back from this whole issue, when I think about, I'm nearly 50, and when I was a child, people were still fueling cars with leaded petrol. You could smell it in the streets, the kind of that leady taste. To where we are today, where the air has literally never been cleaner than before. Yet we have this, this panic about clean air quality, and it's driving a whole load of coercive measures to stop people using the car, to limit where they can park and drive. And I'm sorry, Andy, but the clean air zone was an attempt to do that, to tax people and to take away their freedoms. And we still haven't seen any data that anyone can really rely on to really understand where the problem areas are in Manchester, Greater Manchester. So I think that as the mayor, we'd have to take a look at the whole thing again. Do we really need it? It's disappointing that the government took the case, the Client Earth case, that was a piece of legislation that was adopted from the EU times, that could have been repealed. All we ever hear about now is the WHO guidelines, which are even more stringent than the current law in the UK. And all this is doing is driving a lot of catastrophizing of an issue that I think has been widely exaggerated, and people are sick of it.
Thank you, everybody. We can now move on to our third question, which is on nature and well-being. And this question is from Alan Manning from Ramblers GM and High Peak Area Walking Environment Officer. Given the well-known health benefits, both physical and mental, of walking in nature, we would be very keen to know what plans you have to encourage and enable responsible access to the outdoors and to green space. And that one, could you open with, please, Laura?
Yes, certainly. Well, it's absolutely right, isn't it, that when we go out for a walk, one always feels a lot better, and we must make sure that the footpaths are still there for our future generations. I know some of them try to get them closed, but we must make sure that people are able to access our green spaces. And we know in city centre particularly, that's harder. And I think some of the investment that's gone in the city centre should be reinvested to make sure that we've got more parks. So if we're going to be serious about affordable housing and making sure that people have spaces, we need to make sure that everybody has them. And I think that again, saving of the green belt obviously will help enormously with this, and will make sure that we have nature on our doorstep. But one of the unique points about living in this area is that we have around us all this green space, which we're, by all accounts, under Andy Burnham's methodology, going to build all over. And I do worry about the housing figure that he talks about, because actually there was no government legislation for housing. So the point being, at the end of the day, the design of the places for everyone is just not fit for purpose, and it certainly won't help your walkers. It will in fact take away more and more of those spaces that are so good for our health and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Andy.
Well, I'm sorry, Laura, but there is a government-imposed housing target, and you really should know about that on local authorities. But more broadly, I think this is a really important question and an area where Greater Manchester needs to do more. It's why I brought in the Green Spaces Fund. I'm very proud of what that's achieved, and the commitment I can make tonight is to maintain the Green Spaces Fund and expand it in the next mayoral term. So it will run from 2024 to 2028. And as I said before, one of the real benefits of that is the number of volunteers it involves in maintaining green space and all the therapeutic benefits that come from that. More broadly, there's been a proposal at this mayoral election, I think, to mayoral candidates around the country from the Ramblers Association to have a leisure walking strategy. And I'm happy to confirm tonight that that will be in my manifesto. I think we need to connect up the green space that we've got and create new ways for people to navigate across the city region and enjoy all of the green space that we've got. So that is a commitment from me this evening. I think as you look at development around Greater Manchester, you're seeing more commitment to green space. The Mayfield development and the first park in the city centre for 100 years, but we've obviously also just opened the Stockport interchange with the new park there. So I think that's a sign of the changing thinking that there is in Greater Manchester, creating new green space in the heart of our towns and in our communities. And that, alongside the Green Spaces Fund, I think gives many more people access to good green space in Greater Manchester. Every resident should be in walking distance of good green space. That's my commitment as Mayor to achieve that.
Thank you, Andy. And Dan?
Thank you. Well, it's interesting to hear the Mayor talk about, Green Space Fund and creating, spaces near to people. And there's already, abundance of green spaces and green belt. For example, in my home of Sale, there's Carrington Moss, which is a fantastic piece of land. It's a unique habitat. It's a peat bog. It's next to a large housing estate. Yet under places for everyone. And I'm sorry, we're going to have to keep coming back to this, Andy, because with this topic heading, and that's on the table, it's always going to keep coming up. It's outrageous that you're going to build 5,000 houses on Carrington Moss, and you've got all this brownfield land sat idle, and you're talking about a green space fund. This is shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic while it's sinking. The greenbelt needs to come out of places for everyone, full stop.
And finally, Jake.
I just want to touch on what Andy was saying about some of the work that we are already doing across Greater Manchester and in Stockport in terms of green space, because it's it's nice to celebrate, I think, when we do have successes, and Stockport Interchange is one of those instances of cross-party cooperation where we have managed to install a green space in a district centre that previously didn't have any. I appreciate what Dan's saying about living next to a nice green space in Sale, but unfortunately, if you live in other areas of Greater Manchester, we just don't necessarily have access to that. My vision as a candidate for mayor is to make sure that nobody in Greater Manchester lives more than 15 minutes away from 15 minutes walk away from an accessible green space that they can access. We do have some wonderful spaces to be proud of in Greater Manchester that we should be protecting in any local plan that is put forward, but we also need to make sure that those who don't currently have access to green spaces do have green spaces developed around them. And I'd like to see a strategy of utilising Section 106 money across local authorities to ensure that further green spaces and development continues across Greater Manchester, so that everyone, no matter how close to the city centre that you live, eventually has access to those green spaces that provide such great mental benefits.
And thank you, Jake. And that brings us on to question 4, which is about rural communities. And this question is from Evelyn Fearson, Woodford Neighbourhood Forum, also part of Save Greater Manchester Greenbelt. Greater Manchester is not a city region, she says. A significant proportion of the landmass, 47%, is Greenbelt, inhabited by rural communities. How will you ensure that the needs of those rural communities are taken into account? Because this is not addressed, she says, in the Places for Everyone plan. And Andy, could you open with that one, please?
Well, thank you for the question. It is actually a really important question, because, as you rightly say, Greater Manchester is very different. If you look at the city centre of Manchester, but then you look at places on the periphery of the city region, Ramsbottom in the north, Marple in the south, very different issues right across the area. I think one of the things I will point back to is the importance of the B network and taking control of our buses. I think the benefit for more isolated, more rural communities of Greater Manchester being in charge of its own public transport will be huge, because of course those are the areas most vulnerable to losing their bus services, and that's what sadly we've seen over the decades. So as we now review the network that we've inherited from the private operators, it is my express intention to ensure that every community in Greater Manchester has a reliable and frequent bus service, and that includes all of the areas in the more rural or semi-rural parts of Greater Manchester, that they are connected into the city region. I believe it is a city region, but obviously very different to London. But we've got to make sure that every area is seen and heard, and that we are connecting everybody to the opportunities that exist in Greater Manchester. More broadly, I think there is more we can do to hear the voices of people living in our more rural communities, and I'll make that commitment to do that as mayor.
Thank you, Andy. Dan.
So yeah, thank you, Paul. So I can understand why anyone outside the city centre of Manchester feels as though they're not part of the city region. I mean, that's where all the money has gone in the last 7 years, you know, in quite a disproportionate way. And I've got to say, you know, sorry to be, you know, back on the same subject again, but a lot of the farmland that's in the Greenbelt that's gone into Places for Everyone is actually farmland. Carrington Moss is very specialised farmland. You know, you talk about helping people with bus route when you're going to actively take away prime farmland to build houses on, where there's already places to build houses in brownfield sites across Greater Manchester. You know, I think the first thing we could do is actually give these communities some credit and respect the land that they're on, and give them support to use it for what it should be used for, which is for habitat and farming.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. Jake.
So first of all, I think we need to listen to those communities. If people in the outskirts of Greater Manchester feel like they're not part of this, the region, whether we call it a city region or we call it something else, then there's obviously fundamentally something going wrong with how we're communicating and we are working with those regions. I wanted to touch on Andy's point in terms of the local bus services that we currently have. Of course, it's great to have more control under the system that we have now, but we've also got to consider that the system that we have inherited is one that has had greatly reduced local services to those regions on the outskirts of Greater Manchester. One of my priorities as a candidate, if I'm elected, is to review all of those local bus services that have been cut to those outer regions of Greater Manchester over the last 5 years and make sure we reintegrate them back into the network as it stands right now. But it's not just about making sure that those people have access to the city centre. It's about making sure that they have access to each other, and it's about making sure that we protect their green spaces, but also listen to them to make sure we can prioritise what they want as well.
Thank you, Jake. And finally, Laura.
Hello. Yes. So, well, this is an interesting one because we've apparently spent £4.9 million on painting buses yellow. Now, the takeover of the model that we've chosen, the franchise model, which Andy Burnham has chosen, has actually offered no more routes to anybody across Greater Manchester. So though there's a promise, and I can't doubt that he says that, there's a promise on a new commissioner for old people, there's a promise on a new commissioner for disabled people, there's a promise on, parks, and a promise on better buses, but we had 7 years. And in that time, if I was prioritising what I had done by actually renationalising the buses, I'd have made sure the first thing I did was make sure that rural routes had more transport. It's really simple. So rather than wasting the money on painting buses yellow, I'd have made sure that the transport routes were better. And no wonder they feel isolated. And it's not about going back to what we call the city region. Nobody needs to go all the time through Manchester. People need to go, as I think Jake said, from Hazelgrove to Altrincham. There needs different circular transport systems that work for the people. And I would advocate for that, and I would make sure that happened. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I do bring good news in that we have found a workaround for the submission of comments via YouTube, and that is we have a shared Google document. So hopefully people can see that link, and you can submit your questions. We'll hopefully get round to taking as many of those as possible after the following couple of questions that have already been submitted. The next question is on biodiversity net gain, and this is asked by Marge Powner from Friends of Carrington Moss, part of Save Greater Manchester Greenbelt. Marge's question is, she says, biodiversity net gain rightly falls under the responsibility of local authorities, but fulfilling this responsibility successfully entails resource implications such as staffing and capacity. What measures would you propose to support local planning authorities in fulfilling their BNG responsibilities, especially considering their existing resource constraints? Dan, could you open with that one, please?
So yes, thank you. So I mean, with the amount of greenbelt that we are poised to destroy once the plan goes ahead, because let's not kid ourselves that when you've got greenbelt land with easy to develop on a large scale, that we won't see a brownfield first approach. We'll see a greenfield first approach to development, and that's what the developers want. They've already bought the land and they've been sitting there waiting for this plan to be approved. And now they've got, subject to a legal challenge, which I hope is successful, they've got the green light to start destroying the greenbelt. So when we talk about biodiversity, we're tinkering around the edges if we're thinking about giving more resources to councils. What we need to do is protect the greenbelt, take it out of places for everyone, and keep what we've got. Take it out, save it, and protect it. Everything else is just trivia in comparison. So I would to ask the mayor, if he's elected again, or would you seriously consider reviewing the greenbelt allocations? Thank
you, Dan. Jake.
It's a really interesting question because you guys would have heard me speak a little bit before about plans to increase the percentage of net gain biodiversity from 10% to 20% in any cross Greater Manchester local plan that I would want to work on. And it's all well and good me saying that I would want to increase that by double what we're nationally mandated to. But the actual work of getting that done and making sure it happens across developments is another thing entirely, because as the question rightly states, councils often need to hold these developers onto account. And I think the key comes from working with all local authorities and all planning departments across Greater Manchester to make sure that, yes, the planning regulations and the local plan that we put in place is realistic, but also working with them to make sure that they can and do hold developers onto account to make sure that that actual 20% biodiversity net gain is increased. Because I think across local authorities, it is all too easy to unfortunately fall into the trap of developers who promise so much but only deliver underneath what you expect. So I would happily want to work with all local authorities across the region to make sure that they have the resources and the tools that they need to hold those developers to account.
Thank you, Jake. Laura?
Yeah, I'm not sure about holding developers to account so much as actually making it just so there are more guidelines, so that it's easier, so that some of the councils are really pushed. I can agree with that. I mean, it would be unreasonable to say they're not. The planning departments are pushed. So what can we shoulder? What burden can we take as Mayor of Greater Manchester off the councils to say, look, this department, this area. I mean, when I did the procurement hub within STAR, it was quite clear there was an appetite. I mean, I think there's an appetite for developers to get it right. I don't want to cane them and say it isn't. I mean, I think they want to do affordable housing. I think they want to make sure that they increase biodiversity. But I think also that we could shoulder some of that. I certainly, as Mayor of Greater Manchester, would welcome that, because we've already talked about the well-being, that the benefits of doing that, the environmental improvements of doing that. So I would say that that's something that actually we could champion and shoulder some of that burden to make sure we have better signposting, more guidelines, more assistance, and a whole department could set up around that. I'm sure there's an awful lot of people that'd be very interested to make sure that we follow the best practice for biodiversity when we do any developments. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And finally, Andy.
Showing as Greater Manchester how we are supporting our councils to achieve biodiversity net gain. So I mentioned some of the recent developments that we've seen. Mayfield's a good example where Greater Manchester funding helped support Manchester City Council to develop the park in the city centre, and similarly TFGM funding has helped secure the new viaduct park in the centre of Stockport. The Green Spaces Fund is a big commitment, and I'm going to come back to it because I made a specific pledge at the last mayoral election to deliver it. I have done, and that has supported, as I said, almost 90 projects now across the city region, and they are very localised in some of our communities actually that are the most green deprived communities. And again, this adds value, and it can, where we're joined in with development, can achieve the biodiversity net gain that people are rightly seeking. I think going forward, again, the Places for Everyone plan actually will significantly raise the game. It will give stronger protection to the green belt that remains, and at the same time, as I said before, will require a nature recovery strategy to come forward. It's easy politics to say, oh, just scrap it and get rid of it, do it all from brownfield. Well, truthfully, that can't be done. There isn't the developable brownfield to do that. And what we actually have done is come up with a workable plan that protects what we're keeping, but at the same time allows development so that we can improve the green space that's staying. It's a logical, coherent plan, and it's easy to say, oh, just get rid. Well, actually, to be honest, I think we would be making a grave mistake if we did that, because we'd be exposing the green belt to challenge, as we're seeing in Stockport.
Thank you, Andy. The next question is from Rory Andrews from Lancashire Wildlife Trust. What strategies do you have in place to address empty homes in Greater Manchester, particularly to aid vulnerable groups? And Jake, could you take that question first, please?
Apologies, can you just repeat the question? It cut out.
So, yeah, sure. What strategies do you have in place to address empty homes in Greater Manchester, particularly to aid vulnerable groups?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I think when it comes to the empty houses and the empty houses we have around Greater Manchester, it's really important that we embed them into our local plans across all of Greater Manchester to ensure that they're utilised properly. Laura's already touched on the utilisation of brownfield sites, and truth be told, what Andy is saying about not being able to utilise all brownfield sites across Greater Manchester to meet our housing targets is true. There isn't enough brownfield site across all of the region to be able to meet those. But I think not just working in brownfield sites, but also implementing empty homes into that plan to make sure that they are utilised properly is really important to making that happen too.
Thank you, Jake. Laura.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one, because obviously it depends who the empty homes belong to in some senses. So obviously, if you can get a cohesive plan together of developers and people happy who have those homes to get them regenerated, then yes. But I've never been a great one for just pushing forward on a plan that might actually be very disruptive. But I do think what we could do is use better the Section 106 monies that we've had from developments sort of in city centre Manchester. Now, I don't know where all that funding has gone, and I know that many of the apartments in city centre, I think most of them, are not affordable homes. So I think there's a whole rethink about how we can improve and have those homes and reinvest in them. But I would be cautious about the methodology behind that. And I think that would be very much a case of coming together and working with many people to find out what we could do better. But I mean, the essence, if they are abandoned and left, is right. But the principle must be that obviously, that we respect the owners of those homes.
Thank you, Laura. And Andy?
I very much agree with the sentiment that lies behind the question, which is calling for a more interventionist approach on housing in Greater Manchester. And I'm absolutely ready to answer that call, be it in respect of vacant properties or perhaps more likely properties that are very poorly maintained. So I have made a commitment to bring in a Greater Manchester Good Landlord Charter, building on the success of our Good Employment Charter. But what we are saying is for people, landlords who stand outside of it and won't commit to improvement, that we then give our residents the right to request a property check, and improvement notices are served. It is often vacant properties that are in a poor condition, and they can drag down the community around them, as well as obviously deny people who need that housing the chance to have it. The more interventionist policy that I'm talking about means much greater use of compulsory purchase, because I do believe we've got to get into a different position if we're going to solve the housing crisis. And it can't be an option anymore for landlords in Greater Manchester to rent out homes, often in receipt of public money for the renting out of those homes that damage the health and well-being of the people who live inside. And it can't be an option just to have a home that is poorly maintained and just left when people are needing housing. So if re-elected, what you will see is housing front and centre, a Greater Manchester Housing First initiative, and the Greater Manchester Good Landlord Charter, and the right for people to request property checks will be at the heart of that new drive.
Thank you. And finally, Dan.
Thank you. So, I must admit, I find it quite alarming to hear the Mayor talk about a Good Landlord Charter, compulsory purchase, not respecting private property. I mean, it's one step away from rent controls, and we've seen in Scotland what a disaster that has been. It actually reduces the supply of rental properties and not the opposite. So I wouldn't support that. I think there's already measures in place with the councils. When you have a property empty for some time, the council tax goes up substantially, and it's a choice to pay or to actually occupy it. But I would say as a wider point that we're talking here about vulnerable groups who need affordable and social housing. And yes, the Places for Everyone plan is not going to deliver anything at the regional level. That's been left to the councils, who are more vulnerable to developers, lobbying, manipulation, influence. And I think that's a conscious decision. It's a shame really that, this comment about brownfield, when I did my research, I saw for myself, there is enough land for the next 17 years. I looked at the data from all the 10 authorities and satisfied myself that is the case. So I do not accept that from Jake or Andy, that comment. It can be done. The reason it's not being done is because the developers don't want to develop on brownfield land, not because it's more costly, it's because they won't make as much money. And all this from a socialist administration, you've got to question, what are the principles? What are the values?
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everybody. So we are now going to open up to questions from the audience. So thank you for everybody that has contributed questions. The first question is from David Dunlop from Lancashire Wildlife Trust. Given that the Greenbelt isn't a nature conservation designation, nor is it an open access designation, how would you work with partners to deliver Greater Manchester's statutory local nature conservation strategy across urban and agricultural land? Andy, could you kick us off with that one, please?
The nature plan that I referred to as part of Places for Everyone. We have quite a broad plan that also involves integrated water management and making sure we make the most in terms of improving water courses, that we also open them up to leisure walking as well. So it is about having a plan, a nature plan that sits alongside Places for Everyone, indeed that's required by Places for Everyone, and that's a plan to improve the green space that we have. And one point that just hasn't been picked up at all, obviously we've got councillors from Trafford on this call this evening. The reality is, because Trafford is part of Places for Everyone, it can build below its housing target because the city centre and Salford are building above their target. So if there is to be a move to come out of Places for Everyone, it means that Trafford as a council would have to build more homes than it's currently planning to do or has to do under Places for Everyone. So the two people opposing it need to explain exactly where those homes would go. And I don't believe Mr. Barker is right that there is enough brownfield, developable brownfield to do that. So as I say, it's easy politics, but actually when you're in the position of being the Mayor of Greater Manchester, you have to make difficult decisions, and I believe we've struck the right balance. But the answer to the question is there's a nature plan coming to support the ambitions in Places for Everyone.
Dan, would you like to come in there, please?
Yeah, so I think one of the difficulties we'll find with a lot of this land is that because, as we said earlier, the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, has been going for over 10 years, and now Places for Everyone since Stockport left. All these developers, like, for example, your Wayne Estates, have bought this land at cut price in the past, and they're just sitting on it, waiting for it to be developed. And as the landowner, they have the final say on access rights, on all these kind of things. And, they may cooperate to a degree, but I'm sure if they weren't able to develop the land, they may become much less cooperative in terms of, community access, this sort of thing, nature. I mean, they're just sitting on there. That's just an investment. It's just waiting for a return once it's developed. So again, nature plans, biodiversity targets, or green spaces, all this is just, it's presentation and tinkering when you're driving your coach and horses of environmental destruction across Greater Manchester with the Places for Everyone plan. And just one final point, I do come back to the brownfield land. I was shocked when I saw how abundantly clear on publicly accessible websites that there is enough brownfield land, and I don't know where the mayor's getting his data from.
Laura.
Yeah, hi. So, yeah, thanks for that. So I do think there's a lot of scaremongering. It'll be worse for you if you don't go along with the plan that's been suggested by Andy. I find that really sort of unnecessary. And I'm not sure that actually it's the case with the targets. Well, I know I'm absolutely right. There is no targets. But the fact is, at the end of the day, back to the idea of nature plan. So because of the amount of green belt we have across Greater Manchester and the fact that it sits in a ring around us, that there is something that we could really work on to make sure that the whole thing was more like a park where there was more accessibility. I mean, it wouldn't take that much to think about routes and new routes and planning with people that have a total interest in it as well to develop these much more significant nature pathways. And that would be something to deliver and make a difference. But I am concerned about the reference to Trafford and the building and the targets. I think that just is scaremongering. I don't think it's really what was needed in that particular conversation. And so I just don't accept that. Thank you.
And finally, Jake, please.
I think targets aside, so whether or not the government is mandating us to build housing or not is not necessarily the point. In Greater Manchester, we need more housing. We need more affordable housing. We need more infrastructure for those houses for people to be able to live and work in the areas that they were brought up in, or to make sure that people can stay in Greater Manchester and live in Greater Manchester. So I take Laura's point. I understand the need to develop on brownfield sites first. But we do have to consider the necessary need to have some sort of local plan for all of Greater Manchester to make sure that we can actually deliver the homes, regardless of whether the government wants them there or not, or is giving us that target. We need to build them for the people of Greater Manchester. There's no question about it. But just going back to the question itself in terms of protecting those green spaces and making sure that we're working with partners in terms of the local nature conservation strategy. For me, it's about bringing those voices into the room to work on that revised plan. So making sure that we hear from all of the voices across Greater Manchester and all third parties to ensure that the spaces that they care about and the spaces that they love are protected with any revised local plan that I would work on as Mayor of Greater Manchester. I'd be happy to work with any organisation that wants to do so. I'd be happy to make sure that those voices are heard and installed and put into any revised plan.
Brilliant, thank you, Jake. I think we've got time just for another couple of questions. The next one is on water and flooding. How will you prioritise flood management, river restoration, and nature-based flood mitigation opportunities in both rural and urban areas of GM? And are there plans for additional investment, and how will you ensure collaboration with delivery partners? So that's a three-part question on water and flooding. Laura, could you open with that one, please?
Yeah, so some of the development sites that are planned within the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework are all places for everyone. I just want to make sure everyone knows that they are the same plan. I've had people think they're different ones. They will lead to flooding. So if we look, for example, locally to me, the Timpley Wedge, there are many streams in there, and it will cause problems for people who are lower down in Timpley. And we have raised that before as an issue. So I think at the idea that river management is a problem as well, obviously, because of poor management and lack of investment, rivers then obviously change direction somewhat. They flood, they break their banks. And we've seen that as well within many areas, and I'm sure it will lead to more. But the point is, if we do develop on this green belt, we are going to have more flooding. We are going to have more serious issues because obviously, as we saw in, I think, Cornish fishing towns, where they've had where they've built more buildings and they've had car parks, they've ended up losing the ability to soak in the water, and it's just run off and actually cause more flooding. So it is a huge problem if we don't manage the water that is within these greenbelt areas, because they are the ones that take away the heavy work of the water that falls. And I think that would require a whole new plan. And river management obviously doesn't really fall within the Greater Manchester mayoral role, but I certainly think that it's something that we should be very aware of. And
Laura, we're just going to have to move on.
Thank you. Yes, sorry, thank you.
Dan.
Yes, thank you. So, similar point to Laura, actually. I think about Trafford, where I live, yes. Carrington Moss, is a peat bog, and the water table is very high there, as you would expect in a peat bog. That's how peat is created. Yet this is, houses are going to have to be piled into the peat bog, otherwise they will just sink over time. And of course, all this water is not going anywhere because you're talking about a vast area. So you're going to find there's going to be problems locally around the houses, and I feel sorry for people who buy those houses if it goes ahead, and have to live with that once they've put all the money into it. But of course, all the surrounding areas are then going to get the runoff, the problems. Where does the water go? Now you've got below subground structures that weren't there before. So again, I think what we've got now is only going to get worse through Places for Everyone, and I do wonder why. Andy's defending it. It's his plan. He's put 7 years into it. But, you look at the facts, all it's going to do is make Greater Manchester a worse place to live. They'll still have the brownfield sites that'll be sat there redundant because no one wants to develop them because they've got all this greenfield land. that we're building on, which will be making the water problems worse, and there'll be no affordable housing, no social housing. You know, what's been the benefit of it all is the question, I would say.
Jake?
Yeah, so I lived in Salford during, right next to the River Irwell, funnily enough, during two pretty major floods back in 2015 and 2020. So I know all too well the unfortunate consequences of flooding infrastructure that isn't there and the devastating effects that can have on people. I think how we work on that as part of our capacity as MER, I think it's a case of making sure we push the national government to give us the flood defences that we need across Greater Manchester, so that we can make sure that people remain protected no matter where they live across Greater Manchester. But just touching across our waterways in general as well, if it does flood, you will notice that most of the rivers and the waterways that are over Greater Manchester are some of the most dire polluted waterways that we have across the country because of the current sewage and the dumping that goes on in those so far. So the unfortunate situation is not just the damage of water from flooding, but also the state of that water itself that occurs from that flooding. I would want to, as mayor, if I'm elected, stand up against the companies that are dumping sewage within our rivers to make sure that we have cleaner waterways and push the government for better infrastructure to protect people when floods do happen in the future, because inevitably they will happen.
Thank you, Jake. And finally, Andy.
Seen statistic recently that said that Greater Manchester will get 59% more rainfall by 2050 than what we're currently getting, which, given recent times, that's quite hard to take in. So clearly, we do need a plan for water management across the city region. And again, this is something that I have done. It's groundbreaking, but we've brought forward to the combined authority an integrated water management plan. It's very fragmented at the moment, the stewardship of the waterways. It falls to a whole range of organisations, the big ones being Environment Agency, United Utilities, our councils and ourselves. And the plan is to bring those stakeholders together and manage Greater Manchester's water courses as one system. And that is actually quite groundbreaking. So that plan sits alongside Places for Everyone, as well as an infrastructure plan. And to come back to the theme of the night, if you have no plan, you end up with development in places where there's no infrastructure to support it. It's then a kind of free-for-all situation, and then you don't reduce flooding. In fact, you create more risk of it. The way to do this is to have an infrastructure plan, an integrated water management plan, to support a sensible allocation of land for development purposes. And Dan asked the question, what's the point of it? It's a plan for good jobs and good homes, for investment in Greater Manchester. And I'm going to make no apology for that. As Mayor of Greater Manchester, it is my responsibility as well to increase the productivity of Greater Manchester and to grow our economy. And I'm proud to say at this hustings tonight that the Greater Manchester economy has been growing faster than the UK economy in recent times, and it's predicted to continue to do so. My role as Mayor is to increase prosperity in this city region, and that requires us to bring in inward investment, and having strong plans across all the areas I mentioned is a big part of that. And I'm not hearing any of that from politicians who you think would support inward investment into our city region.
We need to move on to the final question. Thank you for everyone's responses, and thank you as well to Amy from Groundwork Greater Manchester, who I should acknowledge for asking that question. The final question is from Jane Ward from Whalley Range Climate Action Group, who says there is an urgent need to address the climate emergency and it's vital to decarbonise our energy supply. How will the candidates do this? Dan, could you open with that one, please?
Well, I'm not sure I'm on the same page as the lady who asked that question. So I don't think we should have net zero as a piece of legislation. I don't think that the 2038 target for Greater Manchester is logical or reasonable. I think it's 2050 will be hard enough for the UK. 2038 will be a complete failure, or it will destroy things that we need to keep. We need to combat climate change. But do we need to take away everyone's liberties? Do we need to decarbonise at the rate that we're currently going? I don't think so. I think what we're doing is we're impoverishing people. we're taking away choices, we're getting rid of perfectly good cars, perfectly good boilers before they're reaching the end of their life. And, you know, I don't sign up to this groupthink that everyone seems to be on. I think we need to have a complete rethink around net zero.
Thank you, Dan. Laura?
Yeah, so just on that point about whether or not the councils will have overdevelopment, I would, if Mayor of Greater Manchester, support each council to have its own local plan. I would help them. I would join them together, join up the dots. So there isn't just a places for everyone plan or nothing plan. There's a how can we do it differently? How can we join the councils together? So for me, it would definitely be a case of making sure that I had the ability to assist them as mayor and put the funding together to make sure each one could do its own local plan. On the other point, I think it's right that we should be driving our agenda to make sure that we, you know, are doing the best things for our planet, but not at the cost of people not being able to afford to make those changes. So I think the pace is could probably be about right. I think that the goal is right. I think the aim is right, but the realism of it is, if you are going to cane people and I think make people make changes, significant changes. I mean, some of these heat pumps are extortionate, even with if you have a grant. They're just, so I think we should look at it objectively, that things should naturally end their own life. So if they can be used for longer, that's a better solution than ripping them out and changing them for something new. Where we can retrofit buildings to improve them. I know the government's given vast sums of money and we've been doing that. But the realism of it is people need to be able to live from day to day without being punished. And so if they can't afford to change their boiler because it's so expensive, that can't be right. And I think even if we make improvements on that, it's going to be a slightly slower journey, but a journey that we should look to get to.
Thank you, Laura. Andy?
That my mission when I came in as mayor was to make Greater Manchester the UK's leading green city region. And in the area of energy decarbonisation, absolutely, we've lived up to that claim, because we're the first part of the country to have mapped energy systems street by street across Greater Manchester through our local area energy plans. So we know exactly what we need to do to decarbonise the Greater Manchester grid by 2038. And now we're going out to get the investment in to do exactly that. So we've got a really strong story to tell, and I just reject again what we've heard. You know, Greater Manchester has been famous in its past for facing up to the future and to do so more quickly than other areas. If the drive to a net zero economy is actually where future prosperity lies, and if we go slow on it, as Laura said, or stop it, as Dan said, we would be turning our back on future investment in Greater Manchester and good jobs for people, and actually in the end good lives for people. Because if we do decarbonise homes and we retrofit them, that is the way we can give our residents lower energy bills and actually a lower cost of living. We're already seeing that with the drive to decarbonise transport. It costs us less to charge a bus with an electric bus than it does to fill a diesel bus. This is where you can make this work for people. You can reduce fares, you can reduce household bills, and it would be a grave mistake for Greater Manchester to elect a mayor that said, I'm going to go slow or scrap net zero. It would basically be to say, we're just going to turn away from future prosperity. We're going to confine our residents to
Andy,
poorer homes, poorer transport, poorer jobs. I won't be doing that as your mayor.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andy. And finally, Jake.
It's an interesting strategy, isn't it, to come to an environmental hustings and talk about slowing down or stopping our commitment to net zero. But you've got to give props to honesty, at least for those candidates that are talking about doing that. I want to be clear on this. Liberal Democrats are advocates and strong supporters of making sure we reach our net zero targets as fast as possible, because at the end of the day, if we don't have a planet to inhabit anymore, if we don't reach our net zero targets, if we don't do everything we can to stop climate change, then what's the point of anything that we're talking about here? So I want to be clear on that in terms of what we do as Liberal Democrats, and that's stuff that there are already things that we are doing in Stockport, and to be fair, cross-party across all of Greater Manchester to make that happen. But it requires more investment, and it requires further transformation of all of our infrastructure across Greater Manchester, whether that's transport infrastructure, whether that's affordable housing, whether that's further development into green space. There's more work that needs to be done, and as your mayoral candidate, I would want to continue to push for that and to make sure that we reach net zero by our target, because currently we're not doing it fast enough.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you for the questions, and thank you to the candidates for addressing those questions, I think, very comprehensively. Just time now for a closing statement or for some final thoughts from each of the candidates. Laura, could you kick us off with that one, please?
Yes, so it is quite laughable to talk about net zero and build on the green belt. I sometimes feel as if I'm alone in the room, and it cannot be right to even discuss building on the green belt in the same breath as worrying about net zero. So for me, that would be the starting block, that I would make sure that we kept our green belt. We work to make sure that we develop on those brownfield sites. And as I say, it's not a target, but we can do so much better than the plan that's on the table now. And I would absolutely make sure I do that, because we're at an environmental hustings. And anybody who's telling me that actually we've got cycle lanes going in all over the place and we've got net zero plans, but hang on, we're going to build on the green belt, I certainly won't be doing that if I'm elected. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Laura. Jake.
Yeah, I'd just like to start by saying thanks to the fellow candidates here who've contributed to some really interesting discussion on all sides, and a big thank you to you guys for giving us a chance to speak about what's a really important topic. I think we've heard some competing ideas on how we can make Greater Manchester a greener place to live, or in some cases not, where we've heard some climate denialism, which again is an interesting take, but hey ho. Outside of these competing visions, though, when it comes to climate and the climate emergency, it's actions that what matter most. And props to be fair to Andy, when he says that having no plan is a detriment, he's exactly right. But I'm not proposing as mayor that we don't have a plan. What I'm proposing is that we revise the current places for everyone strategy to give greater protection to those green belt areas, to make sure that we are not building some of our most precious spaces. I'm hoping I've shown you guys what my vision is, what we can achieve for our region if I'm lucky enough to get your vote. But I'm also hoping that I've shown you what Liberal Democrats are already doing in Greater Manchester to make our homes greener, healthier, and a nicer place to live. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. Andy.
Paul, thanks to you, Paul, and thanks to the other candidates and for everyone for joining. I am somebody who listens, and when I came in as Mayor of Greater Manchester, there was a very different plan on the table, and I said I would take steps to reduce the green belt take, and it's what I've done. But I also have to be realistic, and you have to have a plan that works and that will pass an inquiry, and that's what we've worked towards, and that is what that's what has happened. You know, but the fact that we've reduced the green belt shows I listen. When I came in as mayor as well, I said I would always take a place first rather than a party first approach, and I've done that as well. And I think you can see the results of that at a time when the country has been going backwards, where everything feels broken, nothing is working. Greater Manchester has carried on powering forward, and we're the place that many people look to, because we do have a plan for public transport. We do have an industrial strategy, and we do have strong plans in relation to our green space. And actually, in Places for Everyone, there is a commitment to net zero building that would be lost if we were to back away from it at 2028 date. So I'm proud of what we've achieved as Greater Manchester. You know, we are a growing success story. I think the city region needs to stick with the plan that it's on, not change course, not break up the 2038 plan, as you've heard tonight. We need to stick the course and actually stick that course to build a greener, fairer, more prosperous, more equal Greater Manchester. That's where I'm setting us on a course to do by 2038. I'll be sticking to that plan if you re-elect me.
Thank you, Andy. And finally, Dan.
Thank you to everybody and for organising this and the other candidates. I think I agree with Jake's comment. We have at least this evening had some competing ideas for a change. So we've discussed a lot of topics that are both important and relevant, but can we seriously debate things like climate change, habitat destruction, reduction in biodiversity, whilst Places for Everyone will see the loss of biodiversity, destruction of unique habitats, and make it harder or even impossible for the mayor and the combined authority to meet its own 2038 net zero target? If elected mayor of Greater Manchester, I will remove the Greenbelt allocations from Places for Everyone. I will not get rid of the whole plan. I'll just remove the Greenbelt allocations, and I will accelerate affordable and social housing construction on brownfield sites across Greater Manchester. That is my pledge, and that is my promise.
Thank you, Dan. That pretty much concludes this evening's proceedings. I just want to thank all the candidates for taking part in what I think was a very vibrant debate, very vibrant hustings. Good luck in the forthcoming election. Jake Austin from the Liberal Democrats, Dan Barker from Reform UK, Andy Burnham, Labour, and Laura Evans, Conservative. Just remains for me to say again, thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you for your questions. Remember to vote on Thursday, the 2nd of May, in both the local and mayoral elections. And remember as well that if you want to vote, you need to register before midnight on Tuesday, the 16th of April. And remember to take ID to the polling station as well. That's it. Thank you again to all the candidates. Thank you to the audience, and thank you to the questioners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.